A desperate child, a dying mother, and one wrong number that changed everything. What happens when a billionaire's cold world collides with a little girl's cry for help? Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now in your place? The morning sun painted the city in golden light as little Lily Carter, just 6 years old, skipped along the pavement, her tiny hand wrapped safely in her mother's gentle grip, her laughter bubbling like music in the air while strangers hurried past with unreadable expressions and rushed footsteps, unaware of the fragile happiness between mother and daughter. But joy can shatter in an instant, and without warning, Grace's legs buckled, her body collapsing to the ground with a heavy, dreadful thud that echoed in Lily's ears louder than the city itself, the sound so sharp it sliced through her innocence and replaced it with fear, her wide eyes darting to her mother's face as Grace's eyelids fluttered shut, her lips pale, her chest struggling for air, and in that single heartbeat Lily's world tilted into chaos, her small hands shaking violently as she tugged at her mother's lifeless arm, pleading in a trembling voice that cracked with desperation. "Mommy, Mommy, please wake up!" While strangers slowed but only glanced before hurrying away, their eyes avoiding the sight, their hearts closed, their feet carrying them farther, leaving a helpless child kneeling beside the most important person in her life, tears blurring her vision until she could barely see her mother's face, the salty drops sliding down her cheeks as her sobs broke into the uncaring air. And in that unbearable loneliness, she remembered the little phone her mother had given her for emergencies, the one she had been told to use only if something very bad happened, and fumbling with trembling fingers that slipped over the keys, she pressed the numbers she thought would bring help, her voice stammering through gasps of terror. "Please! Somebody help my mommy! She's not moving, she won't wake up!" Unaware that the call she placed was not reaching the rescue team at all, but instead traveling across the city, into the hands of a man whose life was built on walls of steel and glass, a man named Ethan Hayes, a millionaire CEO seated at the head of a towering boardroom where polished shoes tapped against marble floors, expensive watches glinted under chandeliers, and investors leaned forward with greedy anticipation, listening as Ethan laid out numbers that promised them fortune, his voice smooth, commanding, cold, until the sharp vibration of his phone sliced into the room, drawing frowns from those who believed no one dared interrupt him, and with a slight motion he lifted it, expecting routine business, but instead, a sound he had never heard before poured into his ear, the raw, broken sobs of a little girl gasping for air between cries, her words piercing, fragile, soaked in fear. "Please, help my mommy, I can't wake her up." And for the first time in years Ethan's composure cracked, his blue eyes narrowing, his breath caught in his chest as silence fell around him, his board staring in confusion as he froze, the sound of Lily's innocence and desperation echoing louder than all the money in the world, and though he could have ended it, though one push of a button would silence the interruption, he found his hand trembling slightly over the screen, his thoughts spinning. Was this a prank, a mistake, or was it fate pressing on the one corner of his heart he had buried long ago? "Please, mister, save my mommy, she won't wake up." The tiny, trembling voice shattered the thick air of the luxurious boardroom more powerfully than any market crash ever could, and Ethan Hayes, a man known for making ruthless billion-dollar decisions without a flicker of emotion, felt something unfamiliar tightening around his chest, an ache he couldn't explain, a human cry pulling at the parts of his soul he thought he had buried beneath years of profit and power. His blue eyes, always sharp and cold, like glass, flickered with hesitation as the room of sharply dressed investors watched in utter confusion, their notebooks open, their pens frozen mid-stroke, unable to understand why their iron-willed leader looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His assistant, Clara Mitchell, leaned toward him with urgency, her voice low, rehearsed in loyalty. "Sir, ignore it, probably a scam. Let's continue with the numbers." But Ethan couldn't hear her clearly because Lily's sobs broke again through the speaker, fragile, desperate, innocent, carrying a weight that numbers and deals could never measure, and with each cry his heart cracked wider. He had no children, No family waiting at home, only empty penthouses and soulless luxury cars, his empire filling the silence of a life built on walls too high for love to climb. Yet now, this child's plea made him feel more alive and more powerless than he ever had in front of the richest men in the city. His hand, always steady when signing contracts, trembled as he slowly pushed back his leather chair, the screech against marble startling the room, his tall frame rising as all eyes locked on him. Disbelief etched across their faces because Ethan Hayes never walked away from money, never. Clara whispered again, firmer this time, "Sir, you're leaving millions on the table." But Ethan's thoughts had already left the skyscraper, already racing toward the unseen girl whose world was crumbling in the background of his call. He pressed the phone closer, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "Where are you, sweetheart? Tell me where you are." But all he heard was muffled crying and the faint chaos of a busy street, the sound of footsteps and car horns mixing with the raw fear in Lily's voice. The investors shifted uncomfortably, muttering to each other, some insulted, some bewildered, wondering if their CEO had finally lost his legendary composure. Yet Ethan no longer cared. His carefully curated mask was cracking, and the humanity he had suppressed for so long surged forward, unstoppable. He walked briskly toward the Jilul ass doors, ignoring Clara's desperate calls of his name, ignoring the questions hurled by men who measured everything in profit, his polished shoes striking the floor with a rhythm of urgency that no one in that room had ever witnessed. For the first time, Ethan's empire felt meaningless. The towers, the brands, the accounts, all crumbling against the sound of a child who needed him. His mind flashed with a memory buried deep. The last time he had heard such a helpless cry, it had been his own voice years ago beside a hospital bed where his mother took her final breath, a memory he had locked away, a wound he had numbed with wealth, but now that wound was bleeding again because Lily's fear was the echo of his own childhood pain. He pushed through the corridor, each step faster, his phone gripped tightly like a lifeline, and though logic screamed this wasn't his responsibility, his heart whispered something stronger, that this wrong call wasn't wrong at all. Clara caught up, heels clicking rapidly, her tone laced with panic. "Ethan, at least let the team handle this, don't throw away your reputation over a child you don't even know." But Ethan turned sharply, his eyes blazing with a rare fire that silenced her completely, and for the first time, his voice carried not authority for business, but urgency for life. "Clara, some things are worth more than reputation." He didn't wait for her reply. He stormed past reception, down the elevator, every second stretching endlessly as Lily's cries continued, each one twisting his chest tighter. Outside, the city roared with noise, but all Ethan heard was a child's desperate faith that somehow, a stranger on the other end could save her world. Sliding into his sleek black car, he tossed his phone on speaker mode, his hand gripping the wheel, his voice calm but firm. "Stay with me, sweetheart, I'm coming." Though he didn't know where. Yet, didn't even know how he would find her, but for the first time in years, Ethan Hayes chose not to think with his head, but to follow the pull of his heart. Ethan gripped the steering wheel with both hands, his knuckles white against the leather as the voice of Lily trembled through the speaker, her words fractured by sobs as she tried to describe her surroundings in broken pieces. "There's a big red sign, a store with balloons, cars everywhere. Mommy's not moving." And with each clue he stitched together a mental map of the city, driving faster than reason should allow, weaving through traffic with the determination of a man who had never risked his own life for anyone until now. The polished skyscrapers blurred past his windows, their reflective glass flashing fragments of his face back at him, but the man staring back was no longer the untouchable CEO, he was a stranger to himself, a man awakened by the plea of a child. His heart pounded so hard it drowned out the honks and sirens that rose behind him as drivers swerved angrily out of his way, yet he didn't slow, couldn't slow, because somewhere ahead, a little girl's fragile world was collapsing. Every red light was an enemy, every stop sign a cruel joke, and with each second wasted he saw, in his mind's eye, the face of his late mother on her final day, the weak smile she gave him before slipping into eternal silence, an image that seared into him with unbearable guilt, guilt for never having been able to save her, guilt that now twisted into a desperate resolve not to fail this child. Back on the sidewalk, Lily's small knees pressed painfully against the hard concrete as she clung to her mother's limp hand, her thumb stroking Grace's fingers the way Grace always soothed her nightmares, whispering through tears, "Mommy, please don't leave me, please wake up," her little voice breaking as people walked past, some stealing glances, others pretending not to notice, fear or indifference hardening their hearts as they avoided responsibility. One man shook his head, muttering excuses about being late, while a woman clutched her shopping bags tighter and stepped around the scene as though compassion was too heavy a burden to carry. Lily felt invisible, her cries swallowed by the roar of engines and footsteps, and though her tiny chest heaved with sobs, she refused to let go of Grace's hand, believing if she held on tightly enough her mother's spirit couldn't drift away. Ethan's voice cut through the phone again, firm but soothing. "Don't be scared, sweetheart. I'm on my way. Just keep telling me what you see." And his words carried a weight of promise that steadied her enough to breathe, her shaky descriptions guiding him closer like fragile breadcrumbs scattered through the chaos of the city. His car surged forward, the engine roaring as he ignored the furious glares of strangers he passed, his mind locked only on the vision of a little girl's tears. Each intersection felt like a battlefield, where seconds could decide life or death, and for the first time in years Ethan prayed, not for deals, not for fortune, but for time, begging silently that he wouldn't be too late. As he neared the neighborhood Lily described, his pulse hammered with anticipation, every nerve in his body alive with fear and urgency, his blue eyes scanning every corner for the signs she had mentioned. Then suddenly, through the windshield, he spotted a gathering of people at the far end of the street, a loose circle forming around something on the ground. His chest tightened, his breath caught, and he pressed the accelerator harder, the tires screaming against the pavement as the car lurched forward. The closer he came, the more frantic his heartbeat grew, dread clawing at him with every foot. Slamming the brakes, the car screeched to a violent halt, the smell of burning rubber filling the air as heads turned toward the expensive vehicle. Ethan's eyes darted over the crowd, searching desperately. His throat dry, his heart in his mouth, he saw only backs, only curious onlookers whispering to each other, blocking his view of the one image he needed to see. Panic surged through him like a tidal wave. Was Grace already gone? Was Lily alone in the middle of strangers who refused to help? He shoved open the door and stepped out, his tall figure drawing immediate stares, but he ignored the whispers of recognition, ignored the murmurs of, "Isn't that Ethan Hayes?" Because in that moment, he wasn't a millionaire CEO, he was just a man terrified of what he might find beyond that wall of bodies. His long strides carried him toward the crowd, his voice sharp, commanding, cutting through their murmurs, "Move! Let me through!" But even as people parted slowly, curiosity tugging at them to linger, Ethan's heart sank, because he still couldn't see Grace's face, only Lily's small frame hunched over something, her shoulders shaking with sobs, her cries stabbing the air with raw grief, and in that instant Ethan's soul screamed a single unbearable question: had he arrived too late? Ethan shoved past the wall of hesitant faces, his chest heaving as if the air itself was too thick to breathe, and then he saw her, Lily, her tiny hands clutching desperately at the limp fingers of her mother, her tear-streaked face lifted in silent pleas to a world that seemed deaf. And before his mind could form a thought, his body moved, pushing him forward with a force he didn't recognize, dropping to his knees in the dirt-streaked street, his tailored suit forgotten, and scooping Grace into his arms as though she weighed nothing and yet everything, her head lolling against his chest, while Lily gasped in relief and clung to his sleeve as if anchoring herself to him. And in that instant, the man who was known across boardrooms as ruthless, untouchable, almost mechanical, felt the fierce surge of something he had long buried under steel walls: human connection, raw and uninvited, yet so painfully alive it nearly undid him. And as he shouted for help, his voice breaking, strangers finally stirred. Faute d'eux. Ness lifted to ears, murmurs rippling through the crowd that had once stood frozen, and then cutting through the noise came the firm steps of Daniel Brooks, the rescue officer, his uniform streaked with urgency, his eyes narrowing at the sight of a billionaire CEO cradling a woman like a husband would, like a man who couldn't bear to let go. And Daniel demanded, his tone sharp but bewildered, "Sir, who are you to her?" And Ethan, with his throat constricting, opened his mouth to speak, but found no definition, no title, no role that fit the storm inside him, and so the truth tumbled out unshaped. Don't know. But I can't leave them." And those words, trembling yet fierce, hung in the air heavier than sirens, heavier than Daniel's clipboard, heavier than the stares of the crowd, for they were the confession of a man who had everything money could buy, but was suddenly stripped bare by the realization that he had nothing of worth to shield him from this ache, nothing to explain why the fragile body of a stranger felt like the most precious cargo he had ever carried, and Daniel, caught between protocol and the raw honesty before him, hesitated for a beat, his training at war with his instinct, because there was something about the way Ethan's eyes burned, not with calculation or power but with a desperation that made it clear this moment had unraveled him, and Lily, still clinging, whispered through her tears, "Don't let them take Mommy from us," and her voice sliced through Ethan like glass, anchoring him deeper into this unfolding storm, and he tightened his grip around Grace as though letting go would mean the end of something in himself he had only just rediscovered, and the crowd, once merely observers, now leaned closer, curiosity tugging at their faces as if they, too, sensed a story larger than the scene before them. A story of a man who had sat in towers of glass, SS and steel, but now trembled in the dust beside a child begging for her mother, and Ethan's mind spiraled with flashes of his late mother, her soft lullabies, the nights she whispered strength into him before life stole her away too soon, and he realized with a jolt that this was why Lily's voice had cracked him open, why Grace's lifeless weight felt unbearable, because in saving them, perhaps he was reaching for a chance to save the boy he once was, the boy who lost everything and built an empire to hide the wound, and now, for the first time, his empire felt like ashes in his hands compared to the fragile warmth of this stranger's arms. Inside the rushing ambulance, the sirens slicing through the night like desperate cries for mercy, Lily's trembling little hand clung to Ethan's tailored sleeve, as though it were the last anchor she had in a storm that threatened to swallow her whole, her wide, tear-streaked eyes fixed on the pale face of her unconscious mother, while her small chest rose and fell with hiccuped sobs. And Ethan, the man who had once built walls of glass and steel around his heart, found himself kneeling inside that small, sterile space, with no thought of profit margins or contracts, only the fragile weight of a child's trust pressing against his chest, his hand instinctively covering Lily's as if to say, "I won't let you drown alone," even though every fiber of his being screamed with uncertainty, for he didn't know why this mattered so much, yet couldn't imagine walking away, and when the ambulance screeched to a halt outside the glowing hospital entrance, he lifted Lily into his arms, shielding her from the chaos of rushing nurses, and the stretcher that bore Grace away under blinding fluorescent lights, her limp hand slipping from Lily's grasp like a cruel echo of loss. And Ethan, usually a man of control, felt utterly powerless as the surgical doors closed, leaving behind only silence and the faint smell of antiseptic that stung his senses, while Lily buried her face into his chest, whispering with a broken voice, "Will Mommy wake up? Please don't." "Go, mister." Words that shattered him deeper than any boardroom betrayal, and though he had spent years avoiding promises, fearing they chained him to expectations he could never meet, he lowered himself to her level, his knees pressing against the cold tiles, and whispered with a rawness he didn't recognize in his own voice, "I promise, I'll stay." As if vowing not only to Lily but to the ghosts of his own past, the boy who once watched his own mother slip away while strangers stood frozen, unwilling to help. Then just as the weight of his vow settled, his phone buzzed with Clara's name flashing urgently, her voice frantic through the line about deals collapsing, investors pulling out, and meetings waiting, but Ethan, for the first time in years, pressed decline without hesitation, his thumb trembling as he shut away the empire he had sacrificed his soul to build, because what stood before him now, a frightened child clinging to him in a sterile hallway, a woman fighting for her life behind closed doors, was more than numbers, more than prestige. It was something real, something raw, something he didn't yet understand but could no longer ignore. And as he sat on the hard hospital bench with Lily curled against his side, the clock ticking painfully slow, he found himself staring at the surgery doors with a hollow ache, wondering why his chest hurt, as though the outcome of this stranger's life would somehow determine his own, and why, for the first time since he buried his mother, he felt afraid of losing someone he didn't even know. Ethan sat in the sterile waiting area, the ticking of the wall clock sounding louder with every passing second, each tick hammering into his conscience like a reminder of how powerless he suddenly was, and when Daniel walked toward him with a grave expression, Ethan straightened, bracing himself for bad news. But what Daniel said instead struck even deeper than he could have imagined, because in a quiet, deliberate tone, Daniel revealed that Grace had once been an employee at Ethan's own company, a loyal woman who had served diligently, until the day she was abruptly dismissed during one of his notorious cost-cutting campaigns, the very policies that had earned him the reputation of being cold, ruthless, and profit-driven, and for a long moment, Ethan couldn't breathe, his mind racing back to that time when he had signed stacks of termination papers without even glancing at the names, thinking only of quarterly reports and investor satisfaction, and now the realization that Grace had been one of those nameless sacrifices clawed at him with unbearable force, leaving his chest tight with guilt, as though an invisible weight had been pressed upon it, making him question everything he had built and everything he had once believed defined success. And in that painful instant, he saw images of Grace working tirelessly, perhaps even with hope that her dedication would secure a stable future for her daughter, only to be discarded by his penstroke, and the irony that she now lay fighting for her life while her little girl clung to him as if he were her savior, cut through him like a blade, forcing him to acknowledge the devastating consequences of decisions he had dismissed as just business, because they were never just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were lives, families, beating hearts, and now fate had dragged him into the center of one he had wounded, leaving him unable to escape the crushing reality that no amount of money could erase the damage already done. Yet as he stared through the hospital window at the blurred city lights beyond, something shifted inside him, a raw awareness that all his wealth and empire had left him with nothing worth holding when compared to the fragile grip of a child who only wanted her mother back. And while guilt flooded every part of him, a new fire stirred in his soul, a desperate need to atone, to do something, anything, that might tip the balance in Grace's favor, though Neil's presence beside him served as a silent reminder of accountability, almost as if the rescue officer himself embodied the voice of truth Ethan had spent years silencing, and when Ethan finally looked Daniel in the eye, he whispered hoarsely, "How do I face her if Grace doesn't make it?" Because he knew Lily's innocent trust in him was already dangerous, already binding, and the thought of breaking that trust, of having to tell a child that her mother was gone because of choices he had made in another life, choices driven by greed, filled him with a terror he had never felt even in the highest-stakes boardroom battles. And in that chilling moment, for the first time in his life, Ethan Montgomery realized that he had everything money could buy, but nothing of true worth, and the very life that now hung by a thread was proof of the human cost of his ambition, a cost he could no longer ignore, leaving him trembling on the edge of a revelation that threatened to unravel his entire world. Grace's eyelids fluttered open as though the weight of 1,000 storms had finally lifted just enough to let a sliver of light back in, and instead of seeing the sterile white of the hospital ceiling, her gaze landed on the tenderest sight she could have imagined, her little Lily, curled up like a fragile bird, fast asleep against the lap of a man she barely recognized, though the world seemed to hold its breath when her whisper broke the silence. "Who are you?" And Ethan, who had built empires without flinching, who had walked boardrooms with unshakable certainty, suddenly found his voice trembling as he leaned closer, his hand still resting protectively on Lily's back, his words soaked in regret. "Someone who should have helped you long ago." And Grace's heart lurched, because in that instant memories she had buried clawed their way back. Papers shoved across a desk, a manager's APOS, logetic voice citing cutbacks, her tears as she begged to keep her job, and the signature at the bottom of that cruel decision, the very man now sitting at her bedside, the one who had unknowingly dismantled her life, holding her child like she was his own. The dam inside her broke and tears slid soundlessly down her face. For fate had an agonizing way of twisting paths, turning enemies into saviors, and Ethan, seeing her tears, felt something shatter in him, not the pride that fueled his career but the coldness that had defined it, and he reached for her trembling hand with the reverence of a man approaching sacred ground, whispering, "I didn't know. I didn't see you then, but I see you now." And Grace closed her eyes, too weak to speak, yet too strong to let the bitterness rise, because beside her slept the little girl whose innocence tethered them all together. And though her chest ached with the weight of betrayal and salvation entwined, she found herself clinging to Ethan's words like a lifeline, wondering if life, cruel and merciless as it had been, was daring her to believe in second chances. And in that quiet room filled with the steady hum of machines, the weary rhythm of her own breath, and the unspoken promises swirling between them, a fragile thread of possibility began to weave itself where despair had once lived. Grace's weak tears still clung to her lashes when Ethan leaned closer, unable to explain why his chest tightened at the sight of her fragility, why this woman and her daughter, mere strangers a week ago, now felt like threads woven deep into his very being. Yet instead of vanishing back into his empire of cold glass towers and endless board meetings, he stayed. He stayed when the nurses left. He stayed when the machines hummed their steady rhythm. He stayed when Grace's trembling fingers tried to reach Lily's tiny hand and missed, and it was Ethan who guided their hands together, his own shaking with an unfamiliar tenderness. And when dawn broke, he made the quiet decision to pay every hospital bill, to shoulder every burden she had carried. 1. Because money that once served only his pride was finally being used to mend a broken life. And Grace, though stunned, couldn't find words as she realized the man who once destroyed her stability was now the very reason she had a second chance, while Lily, half asleep, heard promises whispered in the dim light. "You'll never have to cry alone again." And her little body clung tighter to him, as though her heart already trusted what her mind could not yet grasp. And Ethan, who once believed love and family were luxuries carved out for others, felt the walls inside him crumble as he discovered warmth not in contracts or stock values, but in the way a child's tiny arms wrapped around his neck, in the way Grace's grateful eyes softened even through pain. And as the days turned into weeks, he visited daily, sometimes reading to Lily while Grace slept, sometimes sitting silently in the corner just to prove he wasn't going to vanish. And soon laughter filled the sterile hospital room, Lily's giggles weaving life back into Grace's spirit, while Ethan, once feared for his ruthless efficiency, learned how to be gentle, learned how to be present, learned how to listen. And when Grace finally stood strong again, no longer a patient but a woman determined to rebuild, Ethan ensured she had not just financial support, but dignity, securing her work, her home, her peace, until she whispered one evening, "You've done enough." Yet he shook his head because in his soul he knew this was not charity. It was atonement. It was redemption. It was perhaps the closest thing to grace he had ever received himself. And on the day they left the hospital together, Lily holding both their hands, the world outside seemed brighter, as if the universe itself approved of the fragile family forming in that moment. And though Grace still battled mistrust, though scars of the past lingered, Ethan's quiet persistence painted hope across every fear, until at last, under a sky washed with gold, Lily threw her small arms around his waist and whispered, "Daddy?" Without hesitation, a word she had never dared to give anyone else, and Ethan, eyes burning, embraced her tightly as his heart finally surrendered to the truth. That sometimes fate doesn't knock politely, but crashes through in the form of a wrong number, a desperate plea, and a child's voice trembling with fear. And as Lily clung to him, like he was the anchor she had searched for all her short life, Ethan lowered his head and whispered so only he could hear, "Sometimes, the wrong call is life's way of giving you a second chance." And in that sacred silence, Grace's tears turned into a smile, the kind that forgives, the kind that heals, and the hardened millionaire realized that though he had built empires of stone and steel, it was here, in this fragile embrace, where he had finally found home.